I came back from my Colorado business trip 2 days early, expecting the quiet comfort of my own home. Instead, I found my entire Chicago estate pitch black and dead silent, except for a violent thrashing sound coming from the basement. I walked down the stairs in the dark and found my son frantically scrubbing a shirt in the laundry sink alone at midnight. I asked him what he was doing, and he dropped the shirt completely terrified, bursting into tears. I looked into the sink and saw the water was thick and dark red. Before he could even form a sentence, I sprinted up the stairs to find my wife, and what I saw in our master bedroom made my blood run completely cold. My name is Harrison Wright. I am 70 years old, and I am the founder and sole owner of a massive logistics empire. Over the past 40 years, I built my company from a single rundown delivery truck into a multi-billion-dollar machine that moves freight across every major highway and railway in North America. I know every warehouse, every supply chain detail, and every cutthroat business tactic in this country. I built this incredible life of wealth and privilege so my family would never have to know the cold, bitter bite of poverty that I grew up with as a child. But tonight, the cold was inside my house. I had just returned from a helicopter site tour of a new distribution facility out in the mountains of Colorado. The weather had turned dangerous and unpredictable early in the afternoon, so I made the executive decision to cut the trip short and fly back to Chicago on my private jet. I did not call ahead to let anyone know I was coming. I was exhausted, and I simply wanted to slip into my bed and sleep next to my wife, Cynthia. We have been married for 40 years. I gave her everything she ever desired. I made sure she never had to work a single day in her life. I paid for our son Bradley to attend an exclusive Ivy League university, securing him a Master of Business Administration, so he could eventually take over my role. I groomed him patiently for decades to be my chief financial officer. I trusted them with my entire life and my entire legacy. As my private driver pulled up to the gated entrance of our Chicago estate, the heavy iron doors swung open silently. The sprawling mansion was completely dark. Not a single light was on in the windows. This was incredibly unusual. Cynthia always left the warm porch lights burning when I was away on business trips. I thanked my driver, grabbed my small leather travel bag, and unlocked the heavy mahogany front door with my key. The silence inside the grand foyer was oppressive. It felt heavy and unnatural, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I took off my winter coat, hung it in the closet, and stopped to listen. That was when I heard it. A rhythmic, violent thudding sound echoing up from the lower level. The basement. I left my travel bag by the front door and walked softly toward the basement stairs. The polished, hardwood floors felt incredibly cold beneath my dress shoes. The thudding grew louder and more erratic with every step I took down into the darkness. It was our heavy-duty washing machine. But it was not just running a normal cycle. It was thrashing wildly, as if something incredibly heavy and unbalanced had been thrown inside the drum. I turned the corner, and the harsh, bright fluorescent light of the laundry room blinded me for a second. There, standing hunched over the deep stainless steel utility sink, was Bradley, my 35-year-old son, the man I trusted to inherit my kingdom. I was frantically, violently scrubbing a torn dress shirt under the running faucet. I stood there in the doorway for a long moment, just watching him. His movements were chaotic and completely desperate. This was a man who wore custom-tailored Italian suits every day. A man who paid professional services to detail his luxury cars and dry clean his wardrobe. He had not done a single load of his own laundry in his entire adult life. Yet here he was at midnight scrubbing wet fabric, as if his very life depended on getting it clean. I stepped forward into the harsh light, and I simply asked him, "What are you doing?" Bradley jumped as if a gun had been fired right next to his ear. He spun around and dropped the wet shirt into the sink. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. His eyes were wide with a deep, primal terror I had never before seen in another human being. He looked at me as if he was staring at a dead man walking. He opened his mouth and tried to speak, but absolutely no words came out. His chest heaved violently, and he suddenly collapsed to his knees right there on the cold tile floor, hyperventilating and gasping for air. I stepped closer, my paternal instincts fighting hard against the sudden sharp alarm bells ringing loudly in my head. I looked past my trembling son and looked down into the deep utility sink. The water pooling around the drain was not soapy or cloudy. It was thick. It was heavy. It was dark red. The unmistakable metallic smell hit my nose immediately. It looked exactly like blood. My heart stopped beating for a second. My son was on his hands and knees sobbing uncontrollably and struggling to breathe on the floor. There was a bloody torn shirt sitting in the sink. My first thought was not of deception or betrayal, but of an immediate tragedy. I thought someone had broken into the house. I thought someone was seriously hurt or dying. My mind raced instantly to the one person I loved more than anything else in the world. Cynthia. I did not even wait for Bradley to catch his breath. I did not ask him another question or offer him my hand. I turned around and sprinted up the basement stairs with a speed and agility I did not know my 70-year-old legs still possessed. I ran frantically through the dark gourmet kitchen down the main hallway and up the grand curved staircase to the second floor. The house was still completely silent, but my own erratic heartbeat was deafening in my ears. I reached the tall double doors of our master suite. They were slightly ajar, letting a sliver of warm light spill out into the dark hallway. I pushed them open violently, ready to fight whatever intruder had breached my home and harmed my family. Instead, I froze, completely paralyzed by the scene unfolding in front of me. The room was not a chaotic crime scene of violence. It was a scene of relaxed celebration. Cynthia, my wife of 40 years, and my 33-year-old daughter-in-law, Stephanie, were sitting comfortably on the edge of our massive California king bed. They were wearing expensive matching silk robes and holding crystal flutes filled with Dom Perignon champagne. They looked perfectly relaxed, perfectly happy, and completely untouched by any tragedy. But that was not what made my blood freeze in my veins. Spread meticulously across the expensive white duvet cover of my bed was a collection of documents and items that instantly shattered my entire reality. Right in the center, illuminated by the bedside lamp, was a piece of paper with an official raised government stamp. I could read the bold black letters clearly from where I stood. It was a death certificate. My official death certificate. Sitting right next to it was a corporate life insurance payout form, completely filled out and officially signed for $20 million. And resting heavily at the foot of the bed was a large black canvas duffel bag, unzipped and overflowing with thick banded stacks of $100 bills. I stood paralyzed in the doorway, unable to process the absolute insanity of the scene I was looking at. Cynthia casually turned her head and saw me standing there in my business suit. The expensive crystal champagne flute slipped right through her fingers. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered into 100 sparkling pieces. The expensive vintage champagne splashed across the imported Persian rug. For exactly 1 second, her face contorted into an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. She looked exactly the way Bradley had looked down in the basement, like she was staring directly at a ghost that had come back to drag her to hell. But Cynthia is a master of adaptation and survival. I have watched her charm ruthless politicians and negotiate with cutthroat board members for decades. Without missing a single beat, the genuine horror on her face instantly transformed into a mask of hysterical, overwhelming relief. She let out a piercing, dramatic sob and threw herself off the edge of the bed, running across the large room. She threw her arms around my neck, burying her face deep in my chest and weeping uncontrollably. She held me so tightly, acting as if she had just witnessed a genuine miracle sent from heaven. "Oh my God, Harrison!" she wailed loudly, her voice trembling with perfectly executed fake emotion. "You are alive! You are really alive! The police called us hours ago. They told us you were gone forever." She pulled back slightly, gripping my shoulders tightly and looking deep into my eyes with heavy tears streaming down her face. The Colorado State Police called me this afternoon. They said your rental sport utility vehicle went off a steep cliff on the dangerous mountain pass. They said it crashed deep into the rocky ravine and burned completely to ash. They assumed you were trapped inside. They told me my husband was dead. I stood there perfectly still, feeling the warmth of her fake tears seeping through my expensive dress shirt. I remembered the 40 years I spent sacrificing everything to build this massive empire. The early mornings leaving before the sun came up, the late nights reviewing endless shipping manifests, the crushing stress that nearly gave me a fatal heart attack in my 50s. All of it was to make sure she was safe, secure, and pampered. And now she was looking me right in the eye, holding me close, and lying to my face with the incredible skill of a seasoned predator. Stephanie smoothly stood up from the bed, setting her champagne glass down gently on the wooden nightstand. She walked over to us, her expression perfectly mirroring Cynthia's fabricated relief and shock. We have been completely out of our minds with grief. Harrison, she chimed in, her voice soft, soothing, and incredibly convincing. The bank called us right after the state police notified Cynthia. They warned us that because of the massive scale of your estate and business holdings, all of your primary assets and accounts would be immediately frozen for a lengthy probate process. We completely panicked. We desperately needed to protect your financial legacy and ensure the company operations could continue without any disruption from the Internal Revenue Service. That cash on the bed is just a massive emergency withdrawal we managed to secure before the corporate accounts were legally locked down by the government. We were just trying to protect the family and the business. I looked over Cynthia's shoulder at the bed, staring at the documents. A certified death certificate does not get officially issued hours after a fiery car crash in a remote mountain state. A corporate life insurance claim for $20 million does not get fully processed, approved, and authorized in the middle of the night. A black duffel bag full of millions in physical cash does not simply get handed over by a smiling bank teller after hours. Every single word coming out of their mouths was a carefully constructed absolute lie designed to cover up a monumental crime. "And what about Bradley?" I asked, keeping my voice incredibly hollow, deliberately sounding like an old man in deep emotional shock. I saw him downstairs in the basement. He looked absolutely terrified. He was frantically washing a dress shirt covered in something that looked exactly like dark red blood. Cynthia did not even flinch at my question. She gently stroked my cheek, wiping away her fake tears with the back of her hand. "Oh, Harrison," she whispered, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy and maternal concern. "Our poor sweet boy. When he heard the terrible news about your fiery crash, he completely fell apart. He simply could not handle the overwhelming grief of losing his father. He grabbed his outdoor gear and went hunting on the old limestone reserve yesterday afternoon, trying to clear his head in the woods. He was so distracted and devastated by your death that he messed up dressing the deer he caught and got animal blood all over his expensive clothes. He just got back to the house a little while ago. He is completely traumatized. We all are." I held my weeping wife, wrapping my arms tightly around her, pretending to seek comfort in her familiar embrace. I let my shoulders slump forward. I let my breathing stay shallow and erratic. I played the part of the exhausted, traumatized plane crash survivor perfectly. I nodded slowly, acting as if their ridiculous explanations made perfect sense to my exhausted, grieving mind. I told them I was incredibly overwhelmed by the emotional roller coaster. I told them I just needed a private moment to wash my face, breathe, and ground myself in reality. I slowly disengaged from Cynthia's tight grip and walked heavily into the massive master bathroom, closing the heavy solid wooden door securely behind me. I turned on the cold water in the imported marble sink and splashed it generously over my face. The icy water shocked my system awake. I looked at my own reflection in the large illuminated mirror. I did not see a frail, clueless 70-year-old man ready to be put out to pasture. I saw a hardened veteran who had survived cutthroat corporate wars, ruthless competitors, and impossible economic crashes. I saw a man who was about to go to absolute war inside the walls of his own home. As I dried my dripping face with a thick white towel, my secure mobile phone buzzed deep inside my inner suit pocket. It was a highly encrypted silent alert from my private offshore banking network. I pulled the phone out and looked closely at the glowing screen. The automated notification was clear, undeniable, and damning. The biometric security override on my primary emergency offshore account had been successfully bypassed to access and transfer exactly $20 million. The advanced banking system requires strict dual authentication for that specific emergency override. It requires my live biometric data, or it requires the biometric data of the only other person in the entire world I ever legally authorized as a proxy in the event of my actual death. I stared at the glowing screen as the cold, hard truth settled permanently into my tired bones. There are only two people on this earth who possess the biometric clearance to access those specific hidden funds. Me, and the man downstairs who had just tried to violently scrub the physical evidence of his ultimate betrayal out of a torn, expensive dress shirt. My son. My own flesh and blood. They had not just prepared for my sudden death. They had actively planned it. They had paid someone to execute it. And when the hit completely failed in Colorado, and I walked unexpectedly through the front door, they smiled, hugged me, and welcomed me home. I stood frozen in the master bathroom, staring at the glowing screen of my encrypted mobile device. The biometric security override notification was a death sentence delivered in plain text. $20 million had been drained from my offshore emergency fund, and the only other person on the planet with the authorized retinal scan to access it was Bradley, my own son. The boy I had carried on my shoulders, the young man I had groomed to take over a massive logistics empire, had actively conspired to end my life. They had not just prepared for my sudden tragic passing, they had meticulously orchestrated it. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with sickening clarity. The failed hit on the mountain pass in Colorado. The carefully prepared death certificate. The sudden emergency withdrawal of millions in physical cash, and the violent midnight laundry session in the basement. They thought I was dead, and when I walked through the front door, they seamlessly transitioned into playing the roles of relieved, grieving family members. My heart pounded furiously against my ribs. I placed both hands firmly on the edge of the cold marble sink and forced myself to take a long, deep breath. I could not let them know that I understood their sinister game. If I confronted them now while I was isolated in my own home, I would be in immediate physical danger. There were 3 of them and only 1 of me. I had to become the greatest actor in the world. I had to play the part of the exhausted, traumatized old man who had narrowly escaped a fiery car crash. I turned the brass faucet and splashed more freezing water onto my face, letting it soak the collar of my ruined dress shirt. I grabbed a thick towel and dried my skin slowly, deliberately, erasing any trace of the absolute rage that was boiling inside my veins. I looked at my reflection one last time, adjusting my posture to appear slightly hunched, slightly defeated. I unlocked the heavy wooden door and stepped back into the master bedroom. Cynthia and Stephanie were still standing near the California king bed. The black duffel bag overflowing with $100 bills was now zipped shut. Cynthia immediately rushed to my side, wrapping her arms around my waist and pressing her face against my chest in another perfect display of fabricated affection. "Oh, Harrison," she whispered softly, her voice trembling with artificial concern. "You look completely drained, my love. You need to rest right now. We can handle all the legal and financial matters tomorrow." I placed a heavy hand on her shoulder and offered a weak, trembling smile. "You are right, Cynthia," I murmured, keeping my voice low and raspy. The shock of the crash. The police reports the flight home, It has all been too much for my old heart to bear. I just want to lie down in my own bed." Stephanie quickly grabbed the heavy canvas bag of cash and the forged documents from the mattress. "I will put these in the secure safe downstairs, Harrison," she said smoothly. "Just rest and be thankful you are home safe with us." I nodded slowly, watching her walk out of the room with the physical evidence of their monumental betrayal. Cynthia helped me remove my suit jacket, acting like the devoted, loving wife she had pretended to be for 4 decades. Every touch made my skin crawl, but I allowed her to undress me and tuck me beneath the thick, warm covers of our expensive bed. She turned off the bedside lamp, plunging the massive room into complete darkness. She slipped under the covers beside me and rested her hand gently on my chest, right over my beating heart. I lay there staring blindly up at the ceiling, forcing my breathing to remain slow and steady. The minutes dragged on like agonizing hours. I listened to the rhythmic sound of her breathing, waiting for her to fall into a deep sleep. As I lay trapped in the dark, my mind raced back through the 40 years I had spent building this life. I remembered the early days of our marriage when we had nothing but ambition and a shared dream. I had worked myself into the ground, sacrificing my health and my youth to ensure she would never have to worry about money. I bought her mansions, luxury cars, and diamonds. I had funded our son through the most elite private schools and universities available. I had given them absolute financial security, and their gratitude was an execution order. The betrayal was so profound, it felt like a physical knife twisting slowly in my gut. But I would not let them win. I waited until the antique grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times. 3 o'clock in the morning. Cynthia's breathing was deep and even. She was completely unconscious, dreaming of the $20 million she thought she had successfully stolen. I carefully lifted her arm off my chest and slid out of the bed, moving with absolute silence. I did not put on my shoes. I walked barefoot across the plush carpet, down the grand staircase, and through the dark, silent corridors of my estate. I headed straight back down to the basement laundry room. The harsh fluorescent lights were off now. I turned on a small utility lamp in the corner. I walked over to the stainless steel sink. It was empty and scrubbed clean. But Bradley had been panicked. He was not a professional criminal. I opened the large plastic trash bin next to the washing machine and began digging through the discarded items. Near the bottom, hidden beneath some old rags, I found it. The torn, expensive dress shirt he had been frantically washing when I first arrived. It was still soaking wet. I pulled it out and examined it under the dim light. The dark red stain covering the sleeves and collar was not blood. It was heavy iron, rich red clay mixed with the distinct, pungent chemical smell of industrial diesel fluid. My 70-year-old mind instantly recognized the unique composition. It matched the exact soil profile of an off-the-books restricted limestone quarry I had acquired 40 miles outside of Chicago decades ago. It was a completely abandoned site surrounded by heavy chain-link fences and automated security gates. Why was my grieving son digging in the mud at my abandoned quarry on the night I was supposed to die? I pulled my secure tablet from my hidden office desk and logged directly into the automated gate logs for the quarry property. The digital gate record completely confirmed my absolute worst suspicions. The heavy security gate had been bypassed using a top-tier executive access code at exactly 10 o'clock that night. I switched the application to the live security camera feeds surrounding the flooded pit. The screen flickered to life, showing a black sport utility vehicle parked dangerously close to the edge of the dark water. 2 very familiar human figures were currently rolling a very heavy human-sized canvas tarp into the deep, dark quarry. The heavy canvas tarp hit the black surface of the water with a massive, silent splash on my glowing security screen. I watched the dark ripples spread across the flooded quarry, completely paralyzed by the cold, absolute horror of what I was witnessing. Through the high-definition night vision cameras, I saw the heavy bundle sink rapidly into the deep, freezing depths of the abandoned limestone pit. The two figures standing at the dangerous, muddy edge of the cliff did not look away. They stood there watching the bubbles rise to the surface, ensuring their gruesome secret was permanently buried in the dark water. I zoomed the camera feed in closer, my 70-year-old hands trembling violently against the smooth glass of the tablet. The digital image sharpened, and my breath caught painfully in my throat. It was Bradley. My son was standing there in the freezing mud, breathing heavily with his hands resting on his knees. Standing right next to him, wiping her hands casually on a dark towel, was Stephanie. My sweet, elegant daughter-in-law was helping my son dispose of a human body in the dead of night. I stared at the screen as they turned around and walked back to the parked black sport utility vehicle. My mind was spinning completely out of control, trying to process the absolute insanity of this nightmare. I had suspected them of financial betrayal. I had suspected them of conspiring to declare me legally dead to steal $20 million from my emergency offshore accounts. But this was entirely different. This was cold-blooded, calculated murder. Who was wrapped inside that heavy canvas tarp? Was it the person they had hired to kill me in Colorado? Had the assassin failed to finish the job and come back to Chicago to demand his payment? My son was not a hardened criminal. He was a spoiled corporate executive who played golf on the weekends and complained about the temperature of his expensive imported coffee. Yet here he was bypassing military-grade security systems and dumping a corpse into my private off-the-books property. They were framing me. The realization hit my chest like a physical blow. If the authorities ever found that body, it would be on my restricted land. I watched the black vehicle turn around its bright headlights, cutting through the thick fog as they drove away from the quarry edge. I quickly closed the application and erased the local access history on my device, leaving absolutely no digital footprint of my midnight investigation. I stood alone in the harsh artificial light of the basement laundry room, listening to the low hum of the appliances. I looked down at the torn dress shirt resting at the bottom of the plastic trash bin. The dark red clay and the strong pungent smell of diesel fluid were no longer just clues of a midnight excursion. They were the physical evidence of a homicide. I carefully folded the damp, ruined fabric and pushed it deep beneath the discarded rags and empty detergent bottles, exactly where Bradley had hidden it. I had to leave everything perfectly untouched. I could not let them know that I had discovered their horrific secret. If they were capable of murdering a man and sinking his body in the middle of the night, they would not hesitate to finish the job. They started with me. I was completely surrounded by predators. I turned off the small utility lamp, plunging the basement back into complete darkness. I walked slowly up the wooden stairs, my bare feet completely silent against the polished floorboards. Every shadow in my massive estate now felt like a hidden threat. The grand portraits of our family hanging on the hallway walls mocked me in the dark. We looked like the perfect American success story, but it was all a beautifully constructed lie. I reached the second floor and stood perfectly still outside the heavy double doors of our master suite. I had to go back inside. I had to lie down in the dark next to the woman who had orchestrated this entire nightmare. I took a long, deep breath, forcing my racing heart to slow down, forcing my facial muscles to relax into the expression of an exhausted, broken old man. I turned the brass handle with extreme caution and slipped quietly back into the massive bedroom. The room was still completely silent. Cynthia was lying exactly where I had left her, breathing in a slow, steady rhythm. I crept across the soft carpet and slid carefully beneath the heavy, warm blankets. I lay flat on my back, staring up at the invisible ceiling. I did not close my eyes for a single second. Listened to the antique grandfather clock ticking downstairs, marking the agonizingly slow passage of time. My mind raced through 1,000 different scenarios, trying to formulate a plan that would keep me alive while exposing their monumental crimes. I could not simply call the police. The local authorities would never believe a confused, exhausted old man who claimed his loving, wealthy family was secretly running a murder syndicate. Cynthia would easily manipulate the narrative. She would show them the fake death certificate. She would claim the trauma of the mountain crash had completely shattered my fragile mental state. They would use my accusations as proof of my declining health and assume legal guardianship over my entire estate. I needed concrete, undeniable proof. I needed to trap them in their own web of lies. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep through the heavy silk curtains, I made a silent vow to myself. I was going to tear this fake family apart piece by piece until nothing but the truth remained. The morning sun slowly illuminated the massive, expensive bedroom, casting long, dark shadows across the carefully imported designer furniture. Cynthia shifted gracefully under the heavy covers, letting out a quiet, soft sigh as she finally began to wake up. I immediately closed my eyes, letting my mouth fall open slightly, mimicking the heavy, exhausted sleep of a broken trauma survivor. I quietly felt her shift her entire weight on the expensive mattress. She leaned closely over me, her warm face hovering just mere inches above mine. I could easily smell the sweet, expensive lavender lotion rubbed on her skin. I kept my shallow breathing perfectly even, violently, fighting the overwhelming physical urge to push her away from me. She reached her hand out and gently stroked my silver hair, perfectly, playing the part of the devoted, relieved wife. It took absolutely every single ounce of strength in my tired 70-year-old body not to visibly flinch under her toxic touch. "Good morning, my sweet love," she whispered very softly, her quiet voice dripping with that same flawless, artificial sweetness from the night before. I slowly opened my eyes, blinking against the morning light, acting confused and disoriented. I offered her a weak, trembling smile. "Good morning, Cynthia," I mumbled, my voice raspy and hoarse. I quickly survived the night. I watched her smile widen, hiding the absolute monster lurking beneath her perfect skin. The morning sun pierced through the heavy silk curtains of the master suite, casting long, bright beams across the expensive hardwood floor. I had not slept a single second after returning from my grim discovery at the abandoned limestone quarry. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the heavy canvas tarp sinking into the dark, freezing water with my son watching from the muddy edge. But as I heard footsteps approaching the bedroom door, I forced my eyes to shut and regulated my breathing. I had to continue playing the part of the exhausted, traumatized plane crash survivor. The heavy wooden door creaked open slowly, and I let out a groggy, convincing groan as I pretended to wake up. It was Stephanie, my beautiful 33-year-old daughter-in-law. She walked into the room carrying a silver tray with a steaming porcelain cup of my favorite chamomile herbal tea and a small crystal dish holding my daily blood pressure medication. She wore a soft yellow sundress and a warm, bright smile that looked absolutely perfect. I sat up slowly, leaning heavily against the plush headboard, letting my hands tremble just a little bit as I reached out to greet her. "Good morning, Harrison," she whispered, placing the silver tray gently on my nightstand. "You need to keep your strength up after such a terrible ordeal." I looked at her perfectly manicured hands and remembered the day she married my son. I had been so happy to welcome her into our family that I bought them a stunning $1.5 million luxury condominium in the heart of the city just as a wedding gift. I wanted her to feel absolutely secure and completely loved. Now she looked at me with sweet eyes hiding the monster underneath. I reached out for the small crystal dish, but my 70-year-old instincts were screaming loudly inside my head. After last night, I knew better than to trust anything they offered me. These people were not my caretakers. They were my executioners, waiting patiently. For the moment, I finally closed my eyes for good. I looked closely at the small blue capsule resting innocently against the smooth glass. It looked exactly like the expensive prescription medication I took every single morning to regulate my heart rate. But the air in the room felt incredibly heavy, and a deep, primal warning resonated in my chest. I needed to secure that pill without raising any suspicion. I took a deep breath and immediately launched into a violent theatrical coughing fit. I hunched forward, clutching my chest and gasping for air as if my lungs were failing. My arm swept wildly across the bedside table, knocking the delicate porcelain cup completely over. The hot chamomile tea spilled everywhere, soaking the duvet cover and splashing onto the floor. "Oh my goodness, Harrison!" Stephanie cried out, jumping back to avoid the burning liquid. She frantically grabbed a thick white towel from the master bathroom and began dabbing at the massive wet stain. "I am so incredibly sorry, Stephanie," I gasped, keeping up the dramatic coughing routine while she was completely distracted. In that brief window of chaotic movement, my fingers moved with lightning speed. I snatched the blue pill from the crystal dish and slipped it deep into the hidden side pocket of my pajama pants. "It is fine, Harrison," she soothed, completely unaware of what I had just done. "I will get the housekeeping staff to change these ruined bed sheets immediately. You just lie back and try to rest your poor heart." An hour later, the house was completely empty. Stephanie and Cynthia had left for their morning spa appointments, acting like wealthy ladies without a single care in the world. I locked the heavy solid oak door of my private home office and turned on the bright desk lamp. My hands were steady now as I retrieved the small blue capsule from my pocket and placed it under a high-powered magnifying glass I used to inspect fine antique coins. To the naked eye, the pill was an absolutely flawless counterfeit. But under intense magnification, I could clearly see a tiny microscopic seam along the plastic casing that did not belong there. The factory seal had been meticulously tampered with. I took a small, sharp steel letter opener and carefully pried the two halves of the blue capsule apart. Instead of the familiar white powder of my legitimate medication, a thick, granular, dark gray substance spilled out onto the polished mahogany desk. I recognized the distinct, bitter chemical smell almost immediately. Back in the early days of building my logistics empire, I had consulted with hazardous materials experts to transport restricted chemical compounds. This was not medication designed to manage my high blood pressure. It was a highly potent, untraceable synthetic cardiac arrest inducer. If I had swallowed this pill with my morning tea, my heart would have violently stopped beating within 15 minutes. The local medical examiner would have written it off as a tragic natural heart attack, brought on by the immense stress of surviving a fiery mountain plane crash. My own family had tried to poison me in my own bed while smiling sweetly and offering words of gentle comfort. A cold, absolute fury washed over me, replacing the lingering sadness with a relentless desire for total destruction. As I swept the deadly toxic powder into a small, sterile glass vial for safekeeping, I suddenly noticed a dark delivery van pulling up to the massive iron security gates of my estate. I walked over to the large bay window and discreetly watched the uniform-clad courier approach the grand front entrance, holding a small, padded shipping envelope. I quickly exited my office and walked briskly down the main staircase, reaching the grand foyer, just as the heavy brass knocker sounded twice. I opened the door, and the young delivery man looked at his digital clipboard. "Package requiring a direct signature for Cynthia Wright," he stated, offering me the glowing electronic screen. "I am her husband." "I will sign for," I replied smoothly, scribbling an illegible mark on the digital pad. He handed me the envelope and walked back to his vehicle, completely unaware that he had just delivered a critical piece of evidence into my hands. I carried the brown package back up to my secure office and sliced it open with the same steel letter opener. Inside, resting on a bed of cheap bubble wrap, was a cheap prepaid burner phone. It had no protective case and no identifiable markings. I pressed the side power button, and the small digital screen immediately lit up with a harsh, bright glow. There was no security passcode required to unlock the main screen. The device only contained a single unread text message received just moments ago from a completely blocked anonymous phone number. I opened the notification and read the chilling text that was displayed in plain black letters across the screen. "The Denver hit failed. He is somehow back home. Use the blue pills today. We need him dead before Friday afternoon and the big corporate board meeting. I waited until the house was completely quiet before setting my plan into motion. I told Cynthia I was experiencing severe chest pains from the lingering trauma of the mountain accident and absolutely needed to visit my private cardiologist downtown. She immediately offered to come with me, playing the part of the devoted, worried wife flawlessly, but I insisted I just needed some quiet time alone to process everything. I climbed into the back of my dark town car and instructed my trusted driver to head toward the medical district. Once we were safely away from the grand iron gates of the estate, I tapped the heavy glass partition and gave him a completely new destination. We drove in total silence to a highly secure underground parking garage located deep beneath a massive glass skyscraper in the financial district. Waiting for me in the cold shadows right next to a gray concrete pillar was Jonathan Reed. Jonathan is my corporate attorney and arguably one of the most ruthless legal minds operating in the entire city. I have paid him millions of dollars over the past 2 decades for one very specific reason. He does not ask unnecessary questions, and he is completely, absolutely loyal to the man who signs his lucrative retainer checks. I rolled down the tinted window, feeling the damp air of the garage hit my face, and handed him the small, sterile glass vial containing the deadly dark gray powder I had carefully extracted from the blue capsule earlier that morning. I need a full, rigorous chemical analysis of this toxic substance completed by tonight, I told him, keeping my voice incredibly low and steady. I also need you to immediately prepare a secure shadow trust capable of transferring all my personal liquid assets out of my primary accounts without raising any immediate banking flags. Jonathan took the fragile vial, holding it up to the dim overhead light, without a single change in his hardened expression. He simply nodded, slipped it into his tailored jacket pocket, and walked silently back to the private executive elevator. With the physical evidence successfully handed off to the only lawyer I could trust, I moved swiftly to the next critical phase of my survival strategy. I desperately needed an inside ally. I needed someone brilliant, someone who possessed the intellect to understand the highly intricate financial web of my corporate structure. And most importantly, I needed someone who harbored absolutely no blind loyalty or emotional attachment to Cynthia Bradley or Stephanie. There was exactly one person in this entire world who perfectly fit that exact description. My estranged daughter, Natalie. She is 30 years old, and she currently runs a highly successful, cutting-edge architectural firm located across town. I had foolishly sidelined her for years, actively pushing her away from the family business, because I blindly, foolishly favored Bradley as my ultimate successor. I had wrongly convinced myself over the years that she was far too fiercely independent, far too impossibly stubborn to ever fall in line with my strict corporate vision. The bitter, agonizing truth that I was finally forced to accept was that she was exactly unconditionally like me. She was a builder, a survivor, a fighter, who never backed down from an impossible challenge. I directed my driver to her minimalist modern firm, and I walked straight past the sleek wooden front desk, completely ignoring the confused young receptionist calling out my name. I pushed open the heavy frosted glass door to her private corner office and stepped directly inside. Natalie was standing quietly by a massive illuminated drafting table, meticulously reviewing a complex set of structural blueprints. She slowly looked up and completely froze. She had deliberately not attended the fake morning session happening back at my Chicago estate. She did not actually know that I was supposedly dead, burned to ash in a twisted canyon, or that I was miraculously alive and well. She simply saw her deeply estranged father standing unexpectedly in the center of her private office for the first actual time in nearly 3 long, bitter years. I calmly closed the heavy glass door firmly behind me and engaged the steel lock. I walked slowly over to her side of the room, and I did something I had not genuinely done since she was just a little girl playing in our backyard. I swallowed my pride and I apologized. I looked my brilliant daughter directly in the eyes and told her that I had been an absolute, complete, arrogant fool. I told her I had been willfully blinded by the illusion of a perfect family, and that I had chosen the entirely wrong child to blindly trust with my entire corporate legacy. Natalie did not flinch at my words. She did not shed a single tear or act remotely surprised by my sudden confession. She simply crossed her arms over her tailored blouse and waited patiently for me to finish speaking. Without saying another single word, I reached deep into my suit pocket and placed the cheap plastic prepaid burner phone directly on the center of her pristine, organized desk. I swiped the glass screen, unlocked the main display, and showed her the glowing anonymous text message explicitly ordering my immediate execution before Friday afternoon arrives. She leaned forward and read the digital message twice. Her expression remained completely, impossibly impassive, presenting a perfect, flawless mask of cold, calculated observation. "You are definitely not the only one who has been quietly watching them operate," she finally whispered, turning her back to me and walking directly over to her massive desktop computer. She typed in a highly complex, rapid sequence of secure passwords and quickly opened a hidden, heavily encrypted private server. She looked at me and revealed the shocking truth. She had been secretly, systematically auditing my massive logistics company from the outside for the past 8 consecutive months, because her instincts told her Bradley was aggressively, illegally embezzling massive amounts of corporate funds. She smoothly turned the large glowing monitor toward me so I could see the undeniable proof. It was a hidden, detailed shadow ledger. Bradley had not just been casually stealing a few $100,000 to fund his lavish luxury lifestyle. He had been systematically, meticulously draining my company's primary liquid operating assets and transferring them directly into a completely untraceable offshore shell corporation. I stared blankly at the bright screen as she expertly pulled up the shell company's actual ownership registration records. The dark corporation receiving all my money was entirely officially owned by Vincent Cross, my absolute worst, most vicious billionaire rival in the entire industry. The very man who had been ruthlessly trying to destroy my logistics empire for 4 decades. But the final damning detail displayed on the bottom of the screen made my old lungs completely stop working. The primary digital signature legally authorizing every single one of those massive, catastrophic financial transfers to my greatest enemy belonged exclusively to Cynthia. My own wife had knowingly signed away all my hard work. The ultimate betrayal was staring me right in the face, illuminating the dark room with a cold, undeniable, devastating, technological glow. I stood in the glow of my daughter's computer screen, realizing I had been completely blind for over 30 years. Natalie did not offer empty words. She offered a strategy. We spent the next 3 hours in her secure office mapping out the floor plan of my massive Chicago estate. She knew every blind spot and structural vulnerability because she had secretly studied my home when she suspected financial fraud. We needed eyes inside the house. We needed absolute proof of their conspiracy before we could strike back. Natalie made a single phone call hiring an elite former Central Intelligence Agency tactical surveillance team to wire my home. We just needed a window of time when the mansion was empty. That opportunity presented itself the next afternoon. Cynthia walked into my office wearing an expensive dress and a flawless artificial smile. She told me she, Bradley, and Stephanie were going to the local country club to attend a special luncheon celebrating my miraculous survival. She kissed my forehead, telling me to rest in the quiet house. I played the part perfectly, thanking her for her love. I watched from the second-floor window as my son drove them away. The moment their car passed through the main iron gates, I sent a secure text message to Natalie. 10 minutes later, a plain white utility van pulled up the long driveway. 5 men in generic gray coveralls stepped out of the vehicle, carrying heavy metal equipment cases. Natalie walked behind them, looking like a commanding general stepping onto a battlefield. She directed the men with quiet, absolute authority. They moved through my home with incredible precision. They installed military-grade high-definition micro cameras inside the air conditioning vents, behind the imported artwork, and inside the intricate crystal chandeliers. I walked slowly through the grand hallways, supervising the installation, with a heavy, crushing weight in my chest. This was the house I had built to protect my family. I had paid for every single brick and every luxurious piece of furniture with my own sweat and blood. Now I was actively helping a covert tactical team wiretap my own sanctuary. I watched a technician drill a microscopic hole into the ornate molding of my living room, and I realized the profound tragedy of my existence. I had become a ghost, haunting my own life. I was a dead man, walking through the halls of an empire that had been completely stolen from me by the people I loved most. I stood in the massive gourmet kitchen, watching them hide a tiny microphone beneath the granite countertop. I remembered all the joyful holiday dinners we had celebrated in this room. I remembered laughing with Bradley as he carved the Thanksgiving turkey. Every single memory was poisoned now. They were meticulously crafted lies designed to keep me complacent, while they drained my life force and plotted my execution. "Sir, we have a major problem," the lead technician whispered. He was standing in my private study, staring intensely at a glowing diagnostic monitor connected to the main network router. I walked over and looked at the complex data. "What is wrong?" I asked, keeping my voice low. The technician pointed to red digital alerts flashing across his screen. "Your entire home wireless internet network is already compromised," he explained, his voice tight with professional concern. "Someone has installed highly advanced tracking malware directly into the main firewall. They are monitoring every digital move you make. Every email you send and every website you visit is being secretly recorded and forwarded to an external server." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "Who installed it?" I asked. He pulled up the internal access logs and traced the origin of the malicious code. The digital signature belonged to a laptop registered directly to Stephanie. My son's incredibly sweet, elegant wife had not just been smiling at me over breakfast. She had been actively surveilling my entire digital existence, waiting for me to make a mistake. "If we connect these new hidden cameras to your current home network, she will immediately detect the massive data surge," the technician warned. "She will know we are watching them. We cannot risk using the existing infrastructure." Natalie stepped forward, her architectural mind calculating a new solution. "Do not use the house network," she commanded firmly. "Build a completely isolated closed-loop tactical system. Run the hardwired camera feeds directly down through the interior walls into the basement. We will bypass the local internet entirely and beam the encrypted high-definition footage directly to my secure private servers at the architectural firm." The tech team immediately changed their entire strategy. They worked furiously to run miles of invisible fiber optic cables through the dark spaces behind the drywall. They had just finished securing the final connection in the master suite when Natalie's phone buzzed with an urgent proximity alert. She looked at the screen and her face went pale. "They are back," she whispered urgently. "The security sensors at the front gate triggered. They returned an hour early. We have less than 2 minutes before they walk through the front door." The tactical team moved with terrifying efficiency. They grabbed their tools, wiped away every trace of dust, and vanished down the back servant staircase toward the utility van. Natalie gave me a quick, intense nod and followed them out the side service door. I was left standing alone in the center of the grand foyer. I could hear the wheels of Bradley's car rolling up the gravel driveway. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I practically dove into my private study, closing the door behind me. I threw myself onto the sofa, grabbed a blanket, and closed my eyes, forcing my breathing into a slow, deep rhythm. I heard the heavy front door open. I heard Cynthia's laughter echoing through the hallway. I heard Stephanie and Bradley talking about the expensive lunch they ate. I lay there perfectly still, playing the part of the exhausted, resting old man. Deep inside my right ear, I was wearing a microscopic earpiece the tech team had given me. It crackled softly to life. Natalie's voice whispered directly into my ear from her location across the city. "Dad, "We have a live visual on all feeds," she murmured, her voice trembling with sudden, undeniable shock. "You need to pull up camera 4 right now. It is Cynthia's private vanity room." I carefully reached under the blanket and pulled out my secure tablet. I opened the encrypted application and tapped on the 4th camera feed. The high-definition color video popped onto the screen. Cynthia was standing alone in front of her large illuminated makeup mirror. Her purse was open on the counter. My first thought was that she was taking a medical pregnancy test, but at her advanced age, that was completely, biologically impossible. I zoomed the camera feed in closer, holding my breath in the very dark room. She was not looking at a medical device. She was holding a stark white piece of official laboratory paper. It was a genetic testing document. It was a formal paternity DNA result. I stared at the glowing screen of my tablet, completely paralyzed by the stark white paper trembling in Cynthia's manicured hands. A paternity DNA result. The heavy letters at the top of the laboratory document were crystal clear through the high-definition micro camera. My 70-year-old mind raced trying to understand why my wife of 40 years would be holding a genetic test. Bradley was 35. We had never questioned his parentage. He had my nose, my chin, or so I had foolishly believed for my entire adult life. I watched as Cynthia carefully folded the crisp paper and slipped it deep into her expensive leather purse. She walked over to the heavy solid oak door of her vanity room and locked it with a sharp click. She was making absolutely sure she was completely alone. Then she reached into the hidden bottom lining of her makeup drawer and pulled out a cheap plastic prepaid burner phone. It looked exactly like the one I had intercepted from the courier that very morning. My breathing stopped. I pressed my index finger against the tiny earpiece hidden deep inside my right ear, waiting for the tactical surveillance microphone to capture the audio. The former Central Intelligence Agency team had wired the entire mansion with military-grade equipment. I could hear the faint rhythmic dialing tones as she punched in a long international number. She held the cheap plastic device close to her mouth, looking nervously at the locked door. The secure line connected, and a deep, raspy voice echoed directly into my ear. It was a voice I recognized instantly, a voice that belonged to a man I had fiercely fought in cutthroat corporate boardrooms for over 4 decades. It was Vincent Cross. Vincent Cross was a ruthless billionaire logistics magnate and my absolute worst rival in the entire industry. We had spent our entire careers trying to utterly destroy each other. He was a man devoid of morals, a predator who built his empire on hostile takeovers and broken lives. Hearing his deep, raspy voice echoing inside my own home felt like a physical violation. Cynthia leaned forward, resting her elbows on the expensive marble vanity counter. Her voice dropped to a soft conspiratorial whisper that made my stomach violently turn. "The plan is working perfectly, Vincent," she murmured, her tone dripping with a dark, twisted affection I had not heard from her in years. "Harrison is declining rapidly. The fake mountain crash completely broke his spirit, and the blue pills are finally working. He is weak, exhausted, and completely oblivious. He thinks he just narrowly escaped death." Vincent let out a low, cruel laugh on the other end of the line. "Excellent work, my love," he replied, his voice grating like rough sandpaper. "And the corporate merger documents, are they completely prepared?" Cynthia smiled at her own reflection in the illuminated mirror. "Everything is ready, Vincent," she whispered. "Bradley is ready to sign the final transition papers on Friday afternoon. The moment Harrison formally steps down, our son is finally going to inherit what is rightfully yours. He will hand you the keys to the entire Wright logistics empire on a silver platter." My chest tightened so painfully I thought my heart was literally going to explode. The dark room around me began to violently spin. The expensive leather sofa, the antique wooden bookshelves, the thick Persian rug, everything blurred into a dizzying nightmare. Our son. Cynthia had just called Bradley our son while speaking to my greatest enemy. The devastating, absolute truth slammed into me with the force of a runaway freight train. Bradley was not my biological child. He was the biological son of Vincent Cross. My wife had been secretly sleeping with my worst rival for nearly 40 years. She had gotten pregnant and passed the child off as my own flesh and blood. I had spent 35 years funding, raising, and deeply loving a Trojan horse perfectly designed to destroy me from the inside out. I had paid for his elite private schools. I had funded his expensive Ivy League education. I had groomed him patiently for decades to take over the massive logistics empire I had built with my own sweat and blood. Every baseball game I attended, every proud graduation hug, every single moment of fatherly love I had given him was a carefully orchestrated absolute lie. They had planted a dangerous parasite in my home, and I had willingly fed it my entire life. I gripped the edge of my tablet, my knuckles turning completely white. The massive betrayal was so profound, so impossibly deep, that I could not even produce a single tear. There was no sadness left inside my tired 70-year-old body. There was only a cold, dark, terrifying void. I was a man who had survived everything the brutal corporate world could throw at him, only to be slaughtered by the people sitting at his own dinner table. I forced myself to keep listening to the live audio feed. I needed to know exactly how deep this toxic infection truly went. I needed to know every single detail of their monumental crime before I burned their entire world straight to the ground. Vincent spoke again, his voice hard and highly demanding. "Make sure Bradley does exactly what he is told, Cynthia. He has been acting extremely erratic lately. I do not like erratic behavior when there is $150 million on the line." Cynthia quickly nodded, even though he could not see her. "He is just stressed, Vincent," she soothed. "He will perform perfectly on Friday. You will finally own absolutely everything Harrison ever built." She blew a soft kiss into the receiver and ended the call, hiding the cheap plastic phone back inside her makeup drawer. I sat in the dark study trying to steady my erratic breathing. Just as I thought the horrific revelations were finally over, the heavy oak door to Cynthia's vanity room suddenly rattled. Someone was knocking urgently from the massive master bedroom. Cynthia quickly smoothed her hair and unlocked the heavy door. It was Bradley. He stepped into the room looking pale, completely exhausted, and absolutely terrified. He quickly closed the solid door behind him and locked it again. "Mom, we have a massive immediate problem," he whispered, his voice shaking with raw, primal panic. "The dead body in the flooded quarry is sinking to the bottom exactly like we carefully planned. The heavy canvas tarp and the metal weights are holding it down deep in the freezing mud. But Vincent is getting incredibly suspicious right now. He has been calling my secure line all morning, demanding constant updates." Cynthia grabbed his broad shoulders, looking deeply alarmed. "What are you talking about, Bradley?" she demanded. "What is Vincent so incredibly suspicious about?" Bradley swallowed hard, a look of pure, unadulterated terror flashing across his pale face. "He does not know I violently killed his private elite fixer mom," he stammered. "If my real biological father ever finds out I kept all the $3 million assassination money for myself, he will absolutely kill us both." The audio feed cut abruptly, but the panicked echo of Bradley's voice continued to bounce off the walls of my study. The final puzzle piece snapped into place with terrifying clarity. Bradley had not just attempted to orchestrate my murder to steal my empire. He had actively double-crossed his own true biological father. Vincent Cross had hired an elite corporate fixer to handle my assassination on that treacherous mountain road in Colorado, and he paid $3 million in cash for the guarantee of my death. But Bradley, driven by a sickening greed that eclipsed even his fake loyalty to his true father, had intercepted the plan. He murdered Vincent's hitman, stolen the payout for himself, and transported the corpse back to Chicago. The most diabolical part of his scheme was the location he chose for disposal. By sinking the dead assassin wrapped in a canvas tarp into the freezing waters of my restricted limestone quarry, he framed me for the homicide. If local authorities ever discovered that rotting body buried deep in the mud, the physical evidence would lead directly to my doorstep. My own fake son was willing to let me rot in a federal prison cell for the rest of my natural life if the assassination plan failed. I gripped the mahogany edge of my executive desk so tightly that my knuckles turned stark white in the dim light. A real sudden and sharp physical pain radiated deep inside the center of my chest. It was not the theatrical pain I had been acting out for the past 24 hours. It was the crushing, suffocating weight of a shattered reality pressing down on my lungs. I closed my tired eyes and vividly remembered the 4 long decades of agonizing sacrifices I willingly made to build this logistics empire from absolutely nothing. I remembered the freezing winter mornings driving a rusted delivery truck with a broken heater, my bare hands cracking and bleeding from gripping the freezing steering wheel. I remembered endless sleepless nights spent hunched over my kitchen table, poring over complex shipping manifests and financial ledgers until my vision blurred desperately, trying to secure our family's permanent financial future. I meticulously built a towering monument of extreme wealth, unmatched stability, and absolute security. I simply wanted to create a perfect paradise where my wife and my child would never experience the bitter taste of poverty I had endured. But sitting alone in the dark shadows of my study, clutching my genuinely aching chest, I realized my beautiful paradise had been completely corrupted from the very beginning. My decades of backbreaking hard work, endless personal sacrifices, and unconditional paternal love had been systematically reduced to a brutal blood-soaked slaughterhouse of sheer, unadulterated greed. My first primal instinct was to pick up my desk phone, dial the emergency authorities, and have an armed police tactical team raid the mansion right this second. I possessed the encrypted digital recordings. I possessed the live high-definition video feeds. I possessed the terrifying audio confession of a cold-blooded, calculated murder. I could end their disgusting charade right now and watch them get dragged out of my estate wearing shiny metal handcuffs. But calculating corporate logic quickly extinguished that emotional impulse. Calling the local police tonight was entirely too easy, and it was far too risky. Vincent Cross was a ruthless billionaire with profound political influence, an army of corporate defense lawyers, and the terrifying power to manipulate any legal narrative. Cynthia and Bradley could easily twist the truth claim, the surveillance recordings were illegally obtained, or assert that my emotional trauma from the plane crash made me dangerously paranoid. I needed a final victory that was legally ironclad, public, and utterly devastating. I pressed my index finger against the tiny invisible earpiece hidden deep inside my ear. I established a secure encrypted audio connection directly to Natalie and my lawyer, Jonathan Reed, waiting silently on the other end of the closed-loop network. I quietly whispered the entire horrific truth to them, detailing the shocking biological betrayal and the brutal murder committed at the flooded limestone quarry. We spent the next agonizing hour drafting a lethal, foolproof counter-strategy. We deliberately decided we would not fight them tonight. We would not confront them with the overwhelming criminal evidence while isolated inside the house. Instead, we were going to actively give them exactly what they desperately desired. We would hand them the complete, satisfying illusion of total, unopposed victory. We would give them a broken, exhausted, dying old man who was finally ready to permanently hand over the golden keys to his massive kingdom. I stood up from my leather sofa, taking a moment to mentally prepare for the most critical performance of my life. I unbuttoned my stiff collar intentionally, messed up my silver hair, and forced my natural breathing to become incredibly shallow and extremely ragged. I needed to physically look exactly like a frail man whose body was failing under the crushing pressure of severe emotional trauma and declining cardiovascular health. I unlocked the heavy oak door of my study and stepped carefully out into the brightly lit main hallway of the second floor. I let my left leg drag clumsily across the polished hardwood floor. I slumped my right shoulder downward and desperately grabbed the hallway wall for necessary physical support. I let out a loud, painful, ragged groan, tightly clutching the left side of my chest with a violently trembling right hand. I was actively putting on an Oscar-worthy, flawless performance of an exhausted, dying old man currently experiencing a severe, debilitating microstroke. The loud, disturbing noise of my physical struggle echoed sharply down the quiet corridor, instantly drawing their panicked attention. The double doors to the massive master suite burst violently open. Bradley sprinted down the long hallway, his pale face a perfect, flawless mask of fabricated, desperate, loving concern. He urgently reached out and grabbed my slumping shoulders, preventing my heavy body from collapsing downward onto the expensive imported Persian rug. He held my weight up securely, his surprisingly strong hands gripping my tired arms with an intense, suffocating pressure that made my empty stomach violently turn with absolute disgust. I looked deeply into his dark eyes, intentionally, letting my own tired eyes roll back slightly into my head, playing the tragic broken victim absolutely flawlessly. But exactly as he quickly leaned in close to physically support my falling weight, the perfect loving mask of the devoted, terrified son slipped downward for just a tiny, imperceptible fraction of a single second. A dark, deeply triumphant and purely evil smile flashed very quickly across his pale face, completely hidden from the direct view of his anxious mother, who was currently running frantically up the hallway right behind him. He pulled me aggressively and tightly against his strong chest, actively acting exactly as if he was heroically saving my fragile life from a sudden medical emergency. And he slowly leaned his warm mouth directly next to my ear. "Dad. It is time to step down," he whispered softly, his low voice dripping with a cold, highly victorious, and completely lethal poison. The twisted smile hiding behind his fake concern was the ultimate confirmation of his absolute betrayal. I let my heavy body go completely limp against his chest, acting as if the sudden microstroke had entirely drained my remaining physical strength. He guided me into the dark study and laid me on the leather sofa, playing the devoted son flawlessly. Cynthia rushed into the room behind us, beginning a hysterical performance of her own. "Harrison, what is happening?" she cried, dropping to her knees and grabbing my hand. I kept my breathing extremely shallow and allowed a weak, trembling groan to escape my dry lips. "My heart is just so incredibly tired, Cynthia," I whispered, making my voice sound hollow and broken. "The mountain crash took absolutely everything out of me. I just need to rest." Stephanie appeared holding a silver tray with a steaming bowl of soup and a crystal dish. She walked over with a gentle, soothing smile that made my stomach violently churn. "You need to eat something, Harrison," she murmured softly, placing the tray on the low wooden coffee table. "I made you some warm soup to help you regain your strength. And we need to make sure you take your evening medication so your heart rate completely stabilizes." I knew exactly what was inside that fresh blue capsule, waiting on the crystal dish. It was another dose of the untraceable synthetic cardiac arrest inducer, designed to stop my heart before Friday morning. I slowly, playing the part of the compliant, broken old man perfectly. Stephanie sat on the edge of the sofa and carefully dipped a silver spoon into the hot soup. She brought it to my lips, blowing on it gently. I opened my mouth and let her feed me, but deliberately let a large portion spill onto my ruined shirt. "Oh, I am so sorry, Harrison," she cooed, grabbing a thick white napkin to wipe my face. During that distraction, I quickly spat the soup directly into a hidden coffee mug tucked beside the cushions. I repeated this exhausting charade for 10 long minutes, pretending to swallow, while secretly emptying my mouth whenever she looked away. When the bowl was finally empty, she handed me a glass of water and the deadly blue pill. I placed the capsule on my tongue, took a large gulp of water, and immediately faked a violent coughing fit. I brought my hand up to my mouth, turning my head away from them, and smoothly dropped the toxic pill deep into my shirt pocket. "There you go." Stephanie smiled warmly, completely oblivious to my deception. "You will feel much better very soon." She picked up the empty silver tray and quietly left the dark study, with Cynthia following closely behind her. I was finally left entirely alone with the man who wanted me dead. Bradley stood by the large window looking out over the dark, sprawling estate I had paid for. He slowly turned around and walked over to my desk, picking up a thick leather binder he had brought into the room earlier. He brought it over to the sofa and sat down heavily in the armchair facing me. "Dad, we need to have a difficult conversation," he said with fabricated solemnity. "Your health is rapidly declining. You just had a terrifying microstroke right in front of us." I looked at him with watery, tired eyes, letting my hands tremble visibly against the leather cushions. "I know, Bradley," I whispered, my voice deliberately raspy and weak. "I can feel my own body giving up on me. I do not have much time left." He nodded, his face a perfect mask of tragic acceptance. "That is why I took the liberty of calling Jonathan Reed to prepare these legal documents." He lied smoothly, completely unaware that Jonathan and I were already working together to orchestrate his ultimate downfall. He opened the heavy leather binder, revealing a thick stack of official corporate transfer of power documents. There was a gold-plated pen resting right on top of the crisp white pages. "This paperwork legally transfers the full executive control of the logistics empire directly to me," he explained, pointing to the signature lines. "It also grants me full authority to manage your financial estate, including the offshore emergency accounts, so you do not have to stress. You can just rest, Dad. I will handle the massive burden of the company." I stared at the documents, feeling a cold, sharp fury burning deep inside my chest. He was trying to legally steal my entire lifetime work while I was still breathing. I remembered the 40 long years I had spent building the massive corporation. I had mistakenly believed I was raising a brilliant successor, but I had actually been funding the luxurious lifestyle of a parasitic Trojan horse who was biologically engineered by my absolute worst billionaire rival to completely destroy my empire. His massive ego was completely blinding him to the obvious trap. He truly believed he had entirely outsmarted the clueless old boomer who had foolishly paid for his entire existence. I slowly reached out with a violently shaking hand and picked up the heavy gold pen. I let the metal nib hover dangerously close to the dotted signature line. Bradley leaned forward, his dark eyes shining with intense, unadulterated greed. He was practically salivating at the thought of stealing $150 million. But then I suddenly dropped the gold pen onto the table and let out a long, heavy sigh. I looked up at him with teary, exhausted eyes, playing the broken 70-year-old tycoon absolutely perfectly. "I will sign it, Bradley," I whispered, my voice cracking with fabricated emotion. "But I cannot just do it here in the dark like a defeated old man. I built this massive company from a single rusted delivery truck. If I am going to finally pass the torch to my only son, I want to do it with absolute honor." He frowned slightly, clearly annoyed by the unexpected delay, but his overwhelming arrogance prevented him from sensing any real danger. "What exactly are you suggesting, Dad?" he asked, keeping his tone carefully patient. "I want to sign these documents tomorrow morning at the main corporate headquarters," I replied, leaning my head back. "I want to do it formally in front of the entire executive board of directors. I want everyone to see me proudly handing the company over to you. I want to step down with dignity." Bradley stared at me for a long, tense moment before nodding slowly. "Okay, Dad," he agreed. We will do it exactly your way." He walked out of the dark study. That night, my tactical security team finally retrieved the heavy body from the freezing, flooded quarry. Natalie immediately sent me a clear digital photograph of the completely recovered, waterlogged leather wallet. The official identification card inside proved that the deceased man was not just an anonymous corporate assassin. He was the legitimate youngest son of Vincent Cross. Bradley did not just kill a random thug. He murdered his own biological half-brother out of sheer, unadulterated greed. The revelation that my fake son had murdered his own biological half-brother echoed in my mind throughout the agonizing night. I lay still in my massive bed, listening to Cynthia breathing softly beside me. She was sleeping with the peaceful rhythm of a woman who believed she had conquered the world. She had no idea that the walls of her fraudulent empire were about to collapse. When the first pale rays of Friday morning sunlight pierced through the heavy silk curtains of our master suite, I knew the ultimate day of reckoning had arrived. Today was the day I would reclaim my stolen life. I slowly slid out from beneath the warm covers. I walked silently into my closet and stood before the long rows of expensive tailored clothing. For the past 3 days, I had deliberately dressed in soft, comfortable pajamas to perfectly project the image of a frail, recovering victim. But today, I was going to a corporate execution, and I needed to wear my armor. I reached deep into the back of the closet and pulled out my dark Tom Ford suit. I paired it with a crisp, bright white dress shirt and a solid blood-red silk tie. As I buttoned the expensive shirt, my 70-year-old hands were completely steady. The crushing chest pain and the overwhelming emotional shock of the previous days had evaporated. They had been entirely replaced by a cold, calculated, absolute resolve. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. I looked exactly like the ruthless corporate titan who had built a massive international logistics empire from absolutely nothing. But I could not let them see that man just yet. The trap required one final flawless performance. I walked over to the corner of the closet and picked up a heavy, polished wooden cane. I intentionally slumped my shoulders forward, letting my spine curve unnaturally. I practiced leaning heavily, my full body weight, letting my left leg drag slightly across the plush carpet. I softened my sharp gaze and forced my facial muscles to relax into an expression of deep exhaustion and quiet defeat. I was no longer Harrison Wright, the billionaire conqueror. I was Harrison Wright, the broken, tired old man who was ready to surrender his entire kingdom. I slowly shuffled out of the closet and back into the main bedroom, leaning heavily on the wooden cane. Cynthia was finally awake and sitting elegantly at her vanity mirror, applying her makeup. She turned around and smiled sweetly when she saw me standing there in my tailored suit. "Oh, Harrison," she murmured softly, her voice dripping with that artificial affection. "You look handsome this morning, my love. But are you entirely sure you possess the physical strength to do this today? We could easily postpone the board meeting and have the legal notary come directly to the house." I shook my head slowly, putting on a brave but incredibly tired smile. "No, Cynthia," I rasped, my voice weak. "I need to do this properly. I need to look the board of directors in the eye when I formally hand the reins of the company over to our son." Cynthia stood up gracefully from her vanity chair and walked slowly toward me. She wore a navy dress that perfectly accentuated her figure. She stopped right in front of me and gently placed her hands on the lapels of my jacket. She carefully adjusted the collar, smoothing out my shoulder. Then she reached up and began to slowly straighten my red silk tie. Her touch felt exactly like the bite of a snake, but I forced myself to remain still. I looked deeply into her eyes. Those were the same eyes that had looked back at me with fake adoration on our wedding day. I saw the 35 years of absolute deception hiding beneath her skin. I saw the thousands of lies, the stolen millions, the hidden phone calls with my greatest enemy, and the deadly poison she had tried to feed me. She leaned forward and gently kissed my cheek, her perfume filling my nose. "You are doing the right thing, honey," she lied flawlessly, looking right into my eyes with a perfect mask of loving devotion. "You have worked so hard for our family your entire life. It is finally time for you to rest." I held her gaze, feeling the cold, dark fury burning inside my chest. I offered her a weak, trembling smile in return. "I know I am, Cynthia," I whispered softly. "Today, everyone gets exactly what they deserve." She patted my chest affectionately, unaware that she had just sealed her own ultimate fate. We slowly walked down the staircase, with me leaning heavily on the wooden cane and taking each step with fabricated difficulty. Bradley was already waiting for us in the grand foyer, looking sharp and arrogant in a custom suit. He rushed forward, grabbing my arm to help me navigate the final 3 steps, playing the devoted son. "Take your time, Dad," he said smoothly, his dark eyes shining with pure greed. "The entire board is ready and waiting for you." My private driver was waiting outside with the engine running on the luxury town car. Bradley practically carried me into the back seat, treating me like a fragile piece of glass. Cynthia slid in right beside me and Bradley took the front passenger seat. The heavy doors closed, shutting out the cool morning air. The long drive toward the downtown financial district was an exercise in psychological torture. The car was silent, except for the low hum of the engine and the classical music playing softly through the speakers. I sat trapped in the back seat, sandwiched between the 2 people who had orchestrated my murder. I watched the city of Chicago roll past the tinted windows. I had conquered this city through decades of ruthless negotiation and impossible sacrifices. I glanced sideways at Cynthia, who was scrolling through her mobile phone checking her stolen offshore accounts. I looked at the back of Bradley's styled head, knowing his hands were covered in the invisible blood of his own biological half-brother. The vehicle finally slowed down as we entered the downtown financial district, navigating through the morning commuter traffic. My driver pulled the heavy car up to the front entrance of my glass-walled corporate headquarters. The towering skyscraper reflected the bright morning sunlight. The driver opened my door, and Bradley rushed over to help me out, playing his fake part. I gripped the brass handle of my wooden cane and planted my feet onto the cold concrete pavement. We slowly walked through the thick glass doors and stepped into the grand marble lobby. My gaze cut straight across the massive room toward the polished reception desk. Standing there perfectly still amidst the morning rush was Natalie. My loyal daughter was dressed in a sharp black suit. She looked like a trained professional assassin waiting. Our eyes locked from across the wide corporate lobby. We did not exchange any words or make any obvious gestures. We simply shared one silent, subtle nod. The trap was now fully primed. We moved past the reception desk. I walked across the polished marble floor of the lobby, keeping my head bowed and my shoulders slumped to maintain the illusion of my fragile state. Bradley kept a firm grip on my elbow, guiding me toward the private elevator that serviced the 50th floor. Cynthia walked closely beside me, holding her handbag tight against her chest, while she offered bright fake smiles to the passing employees. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and we stepped inside. The ride up to the 50th floor was completely silent. I watched the digital numbers climb, feeling the heavy anticipation building within my chest. They thought they were taking an old, broken man up to his final surrender, but they were actually leading themselves directly into an execution chamber. The doors parted, and we stepped out into the reception area. The double doors leading into the boardroom were already propped open. A hum of conversation drifted out into the hallway. I leaned heavily on my cane, taking slow, deliberate steps as we crossed the threshold. The massive boardroom was completely packed. The mahogany table filled the center of the room, surrounded by tall leather chairs. Every member of the corporate board of directors was already seated. These were the people I had handpicked over the decades to guide my logistics empire. They looked up as I entered, their faces showing a mixture of concern and respect. Stephanie sat near the head of the table, wearing a perfectly crafted expression of somber anticipation. She quickly stood up and pulled out the large leather chair designated for me. I shuffled over to the head of the table and lowered my body into the seat, letting out a soft, ragged sigh for dramatic effect. Bradley took the seat to my right, while Cynthia sat gracefully to my left. The entire room fell into absolute silence. I looked down at the surface of the mahogany table. Resting perfectly centered was a thick stack of official corporate transfer documents. They were printed on heavy paper and marked with yellow adhesive tabs, indicating exactly where I needed to sign away my entire life of hard work. Bradley leaned closer to me, his eyes shining with barely contained greed. "We are ready whenever you are, Dad," he whispered, his voice dripping with fake affection. The board members leaned forward, waiting. I prepared to deliver my opening remarks when a sudden commotion at the back of the room interrupted. The double doors swung open, and a tall figure walked confidently into the boardroom. A gasp rippled through the directors. It was Vincent Cross, my worst rival in the industry and the biological father of the man sitting next to me. He wore a tailored suit and an arrogant smile, making him look like a hungry shark circling wounded prey. Vincent. "What are you doing here?" demanded a board member standing up in outrage. "You have no business being in this building." Vincent chuckled, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Please calm down, everyone," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the room. "I am not here to cause trouble today. I am here as a strategic partner to witness this historic transition of power." He walked toward the front of the room, his eyes locked on me. "Your son Bradley invited me to attend," he explained, gesturing toward the man sitting to my right. "We have been discussing joint ventures between our companies once he assumes the role of chief executive officer." The board members began murmuring in confused tones. They knew the bitter rivalry between my logistics empire and Vincent Cross. The idea of a sudden partnership made absolutely no sense to them, but they were too shocked by my apparent failing health to openly challenge the decision. I looked directly at Vincent, watching his smug face as he took an empty seat near the corner of the room. He believed he had won. He truly believed his 35-year-long deception had finally culminated in his ultimate victory. He had planted his biological son in my home, slept with my wife, and orchestrated a hostile takeover of my company without spending a single dime of his own money. I turned my head slowly and looked at my wife. Cynthia was staring down at her manicured hands, a faint, triumphant smile playing on her lips. She had played the long game perfectly, and now she was moments away from claiming her massive reward. Bradley reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavy gold-plated pen. He gently placed it on the table right next to the transfer documents. "It is time, Dad," he urged softly, his voice completely devoid of any real empathy. "Just sign the papers on the marked tabs, and you can finally rest." He was practically salivating at the thought of gaining absolute control. The greed radiating from his body was almost a physical force in the room. I stared quietly at the shiny gold pen reflecting the bright overhead lights. I reached out with a trembling hand and slowly picked up the gold pen. I traced the smooth, cool metal. I looked down at the white transfer document, reading the bold black letters, declaring my permanent resignation. The room was so quiet, I could hear the ticking of a watch. Every eye in the room was focused on my hands, waiting for the ink to touch the paper. I held the pen hovering just a fraction of an inch above the signature line. I let the silence stretch out for 10 agonizing seconds. Then I stopped trembling. My hand became perfectly rock-solid steady. I placed the gold pen back down onto the table with a sharp, decisive click. I did not sign a single letter. Instead, I slowly placed my hands flat on the polished wood and pushed myself up from the leather chair. I did not struggle. I did not lean on my wooden cane for support. I stood up completely straight, pulling my shoulders back and lifting my chin high. The stooped, broken posture of the dying old man vanished entirely, replaced by the commanding, dominant presence of the conqueror who built this empire from scratch. A wave of absolute shock washed over the faces of the board members. Bradley stared up at me, his jaw dropping open in sudden, terrifying confusion. Cynthia shrank back into her chair, her fake smile instantly evaporating into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Even Vincent Cross lost his smug expression, gripping the armrests of his chair tightly. I reached down, picked up the wooden cane, and tossed it onto the center of the table, where it clattered against the wood. Then I reached deep into the side pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small black electronic remote control. I held it up for everyone to see and pressed the single red button in the center. A loud, sharp clack echoed through the massive room, followed by the heavy, engaging thud of military-grade magnetic locks sealing the doors shut. The trap was sprung and no one was leaving. The heavy metallic clack of the magnetic locks engaging echoed through the massive glass-walled boardroom like the final strike of a judge's gavel. For a fraction of a second, the room remained completely submerged in an eerie, suffocating silence. The 50 senior directors sitting around the long, polished mahogany table simply stared at the heavy wooden double doors, trying to process the sudden, undeniable finality of that sound. I stood perfectly straight at the head of the table, feeling the lingering illusion of the frail, dying 70-year-old man completely melt away from my bones. The physical act of standing tall after days of deliberately slouching and dragging my feet sent a rush of pure, unadulterated adrenaline straight through my veins. I looked down at the expensive gold-plated pen resting innocently on top of the crisp white transfer of power documents. Bradley was still sitting directly to my right, his hand half extended toward the paperwork, his face frozen in a mask of absolute bewilderment. He looked exactly like a predator that had just realized it had willingly walked directly into a steel cage. I reached out and gently pushed the thick stack of legal documents away from me, sliding them across the smooth, polished wood until they came to a complete stop right in front of him. I took a long, deep breath, pulling the cool, filtered air of the corporate headquarters deep into my lungs, and let my true voice ring out for the first time in days. "I am not signing a damn thing," I declared, my voice booming with the exact same ruthless, authoritative cadence that had successfully built this $150 million logistics empire from a single rusted delivery truck. The deep baritone sound bounced off the high glass windows and struck the directors with absolute physical force. Cynthia physically recoiled in her expensive leather chair, her perfectly manicured hands flying up to cover her mouth as the carefully constructed reality she had manufactured over 35 years began to violently fracture. Vincent Cross, the ruthless billionaire who had confidently strolled into the room moments ago, expecting a glorious coronation, suddenly gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. The arrogant, smug shark-like smile that had previously decorated his face evaporated in an instant, replaced by a dark, heavy cloud of paranoid uncertainty. They had all come to this prestigious room to eagerly feast on the remains of a broken, defeated old titan. Instead, they were now locked inside a highly secured vault, with a man who was fully prepared to burn their entire fraudulent world straight down to the absolute ground. Bradley desperately scrambled to save the crumbling narrative. He aggressively pushed his chair back and stood up, waving his hands in a frantic, chaotic motion meant to generate immediate sympathy from the completely bewildered board members. "He needs medical attention right now," Bradley shouted, his voice cracking with a perfectly executed tone of terrified filial concern. "Please, everyone, you have to understand the severe trauma of the mountain helicopter crash has completely shattered his fragile mind. His dementia is acting up violently, and he is clearly having another dangerous microstroke right in front of us." He reached out to grab my shoulder, attempting to physically force me back down into the heavy leather chair. "Do not touch me," I snapped, my voice cracking like a leather whip across the silent room. He instantly froze, his hand hovering just inches from my tailored suit jacket. I looked him directly in the eyes, refusing to break eye contact, as I reached my right hand deep into the inner pocket of my jacket. The directors were collectively holding their breath, completely unsure if they were witnessing a tragic medical emergency or the sudden, terrifying resurrection of their legendary chief executive officer. I wrapped my fingers around a small, custom-built digital remote control resting in the dark fabric, and my thumb gently found the primary activation switch. "Let us completely dispense with this pathetic, disgusting theater," I stated coldly, keeping my unwavering gaze locked directly onto my fake son's rapidly paling face. "You all came here today to witness the final transition of my corporate power and my vast financial estate. And you are indeed going to witness a transition today, but it will be a transition into absolute, indisputable truth. I pressed the central button on the hidden remote. Above our heads, the seamless ceiling panels quietly slid apart with a soft, mechanical whir. Three massive, high-definition projector screens silently descended into the center of the boardroom, smoothly locking into place with perfect precision. The automatic window blinds immediately rolled down, plunging the massive room into a dramatic, suffocating darkness before the bright digital projectors flared to life. The 50 board members collectively gasped as the massive screens illuminated the room with crystal-clear military-grade surveillance footage. It was not a graph showing quarterly earnings or a presentation about logistical supply chains. It was a live, recorded interior view of my own master suite back at the Chicago estate. The timestamp glowing in the bottom corner of the digital projection clearly indicated the footage was captured just yesterday morning, right after I had successfully faked my first severe physical collapse. The silent, high-definition video began to play, displaying the undeniable reality of my family's ultimate betrayal in brilliant color. The screen showed the heavy wooden door of the master bedroom opening slowly. Stephanie, my beautiful, elegant daughter-in-law, confidently walked into the frame, carrying a silver tray with a steaming porcelain cup of herbal tea and my daily blood pressure medication. The board members leaned forward in their leather chairs, completely captivated by the bizarre domestic scene unfolding before their eyes. The camera angle was positioned perfectly, providing an unobstructed, absolute clear view of her manicured hands. We all watched in absolute silence as Stephanie carefully set the silver tray down onto the wooden nightstand. We watched as she casually looked over her shoulder to ensure the long hallway was completely empty. And then the entire boardroom watched as she reached deep into the hidden side pocket of her soft yellow sundress, pulling out a completely identical fake blue capsule. The giant screen showed her smoothly swapping my legitimate heart medication with the potent, untraceable cardiac arrest inducer. A horrified gasp erupted from the 50 directors, echoing violently around the dark room. Several men cursed in pure shock while others covered their faces in absolute disbelief. The white light fiercely illuminated Stephanie's face where she sat near the table. Her flawless mask completely melted away, leaving nothing but raw, animalistic terror. Her skin turned pale, and she violently shoved her heavy chair backward, completely abandoning the facade. She let out a desperate sob and sprinted toward the double doors, pulling at the heavy brass handles. She pulled with all her physical strength, ignoring the tearing of her expensive silk dress, but the thick magnetic locks held firm. She was trapped securely inside the execution chamber with the exact same dead man she had confidently tried to murder. I let the absolute panic of my daughter-in-law wash over the room. For a few long, agonizing seconds, the board members were shifting uncomfortably in their expensive leather chairs, murmuring in deeply shocked voices, completely unable to comprehend the terrifying depth of the betrayal unfolding right before their eyes. I raised my hand slightly, and the entire room instantly fell completely silent again. I pressed the second small button on my digital remote control. The high-definition footage of Stephanie freezing in the master bedroom vanished entirely from the massive projector screens. It was immediately replaced by a brand-new live recording. This time, the hidden tactical camera angle showed the luxurious interior of Cynthia's private vanity room. The 50 board members watched in absolute silence as my wife of 40 long years stood alone in front of her brightly illuminated makeup mirror. She was holding a crisp, white piece of official laboratory paper in her perfectly manicured hands. I deliberately zoomed the digital image in, much closer, projecting the document across the entire massive wall, so every single person sitting in the dark boardroom could easily read the bold black letters printed clearly at the very top. It was a formal genetic paternity test. A collective loud gasp echoed sharply through the dark room as the senior directors read the shocking, undeniable results of the complex genetic analysis. Cynthia let out a strangled, terrified cry from her seat at my left side. She violently threw her shaking hands over her pale face, shaking her head rapidly, as if she could somehow magically deny the undeniable physical evidence proudly projected in front of all her professional peers. but I was absolutely not finished dismantling her fake life. I tapped another small button on the black remote. The crisp, clear audio from the hidden military-grade tactical microphone instantly filled the silent corporate boardroom. My wife's own voice echoed loudly through the high-quality surround sound speakers, dripping with a dark, twisted affection I had never once heard her use during our entire marriage. "The plan is working perfectly, Vincent," her recorded voice murmured softly into a cheap, prepaid burner phone. "Harrison is declining rapidly. The fake mountain crash completely broke his spirit, and the blue pills are finally working. He thinks he just narrowly escaped death." Every single senior director in the massive room turned their heads simultaneously to look directly at Vincent Cross. The arrogant, smug, shark-like smile that had previously decorated his confident face since the moment he walked through the heavy double doors had completely vanished without a single trace. He was sitting completely rigid in his expensive leather chair, his dark eyes wide with sudden primal fear. The recording continued to play loudly, ruthlessly, exposing every single miserable layer of their monumental 35-year deception to the entire business world. "Everything is ready." Cynthia's voice whispered softly through the overhead speakers. "Bradley is ready to sign the final transition papers on Friday afternoon. The moment Harrison formally steps down, our son is finally going to inherit what is rightfully yours. He will hand you the keys to the entire Wright Logistics empire on a beautiful silver platter." I stopped the audio playback with a sharp click, letting the heavy, suffocating silence return fully to the massive glass-walled room. I turned my head very slowly and locked my tired eyes directly onto Vincent Cross. The ruthless billionaire rival looked exactly like a man who had just stepped blindly onto a hidden explosive landmine. I walked slowly and deliberately around the edge of the long, polished mahogany table, my leather shoes echoing loudly against the hard floor. "Congratulations, Vincent," I said smoothly, keeping my deep voice incredibly calm, freezing cold and razor-sharp. "You successfully planted your bastard in my house. You managed to orchestrate an impressive 35-year affair right under my nose while I was busy building an empire." I watched his thick throat swallow hard as the board members stared at him with absolute, total disgust. "You successfully fooled a man who trusted his family blindly." I continued, my voice bouncing off the high glass windows. "But you made one fatal, monumental mistake in your grand master plan." I stopped walking and pointed a steady finger directly at the terrified, sweating man sitting to my right. "You should have taught him loyalty." Bradley was hyperventilating uncontrollably, now his chest heaving violently up and down, as he slowly realized his entire fraudulent, luxurious existence was being systematically, permanently dismantled in front of the most powerful, wealthy people in the entire city. He frantically looked at his biological father sitting across the room. Then he desperately looked up at me, completely, hopelessly, trapped in a terrifying nightmare of his own foolish making. I calmly walked back to the head of the long table and held up the small digital remote control one final glorious time. I looked directly down at Bradley, seeing the absolute raw terror radiating from his pale, sweating face. "You truly thought you were the absolute smartest person in this entire room," I told him very softly, so only he could hear the deep disappointment in my voice. "You arrogant boy. You honestly thought you could easily outsmart the man who kindly raised you and outsmart the man who secretly created you. You thought you could play us both and walk away an incredibly rich man." I pressed the final red button on the remote. A brand new audio file immediately began to play loudly through the overhead speakers, cutting through the heavy tension in the room. It was Bradley's own highly panicked voice, secretly recorded just moments after Cynthia had finally finished her secret phone call with Vincent. "Mom, we have a massive immediate problem," his recorded voice trembled with raw, unadulterated panic. "The dead body in the flooded quarry is sinking to the bottom, exactly like we carefully planned. The heavy canvas tarp and the metal weights are securely holding it down deep in the freezing mud. But Vincent is getting incredibly suspicious right now. He has been calling my secure line all morning, demanding constant updates. The 50 directors were holding their collective breath, staring at Bradley in absolute sheer horror as his own recorded confession permanently condemned him. Vincent Cross leaned aggressively forward in his leather chair, his face instantly turning a highly dangerous shade of furious dark red as he listened intently to his biological son's incredibly treacherous words. He does not know I violently killed his private elite fixer, Mom. The loud recording continued playing, sealing Bradley's ultimate, inescapable fate. If my real biological father ever actually finds out, I selfishly kept all the $3 million assassination money entirely for myself, he will absolutely violently kill us both. The final words of the secret audio recording hung heavily in the freezing air of the locked corporate boardroom. The absolute silence that followed was completely deafening. Bradley slowly lowered his trembling head down toward the polished mahogany table, fully realizing that his own unbelievable greed had successfully managed to dig his permanent grave. I stood silently there, watching my enemies fall. Vincent Cross remained absolutely paralyzed in his heavy leather chair for several agonizing seconds. The arrogant billionaire who had spent his entire ruthless career manipulating markets and destroying rival companies was currently incapable of processing the devastating magnitude of the audio recording. He slowly turned his head away from the massive projector screens and locked his dark, furious eyes directly onto the pale, trembling face of his own biological son. The sophisticated, polished facade of the wealthy business tycoon began to violently fracture and physically melt away right in front of the entire corporate board of directors. The deep, healthy color completely drained from his thick neck and face, leaving behind a terrifying shade of sickly gray. His broad shoulders began to heave up and down with rapid, shallow breaths as his mind desperately tried to reject the horrifying truth. But the undeniable reality was already sinking deep into his bones. The elite private fixer he had personally hired to execute my assassination in the snowy mountains of Colorado was not just a random, disposable mercenary. He was a trusted member of his own family. Vincent slowly placed both of his large, trembling hands flat against the polished surface of the mahogany table and pushed his heavy body upward. He stood completely upright, his massive frame casting a long, dark shadow across the crisp, white legal documents scattered carelessly across the wood. Bradley physically shrank back into his expensive chair, desperately trying to put as much physical distance as possible between himself and the towering, furious man standing just a few feet away. The silence in the massive glass-walled room was so incredibly thick and oppressive that the faint mechanical humming of the high-definition projectors sounded like a roaring jet engine. Vincent opened his mouth, but the words seemed to physically choke him before they could escape his throat. His face contorted into a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated horror and raw, animalistic grief. When he finally managed to force the sound out of his chest, his raspy voice was entirely devoid of its usual sophisticated corporate polish. It was a low, terrifying, guttural snarl that echoed violently against the high ceiling. "The private fixer you violently killed in cold blood," he whispered, his voice shaking with a devastating combination of sorrow and absolute murderous rage. "That young man was not just an anonymous hired gun, you stupid, greedy fool. That young man was my legitimate youngest son." The crushing weight of that shocking revelation slammed into Bradley with the destructive physical force of a runaway freight train. His dark eyes widened to an impossible size and his jaw dropped completely open in absolute stunned disbelief. He had foolishly believed he was simply eliminating a random, dangerous criminal to secure a massive financial payout for himself. He had absolutely no idea he had brutally murdered his own biological half-brother and dumped his heavy, lifeless body into the freezing mud of an abandoned limestone quarry. Before Bradley could even attempt to formulate a pathetic excuse or beg for any kind of mercy, the fragile tension in the room violently snapped. The sophisticated, wealthy villains instantly turned on each other with the terrifying ferocity of starving rabid dogs. Vincent let out a deafening roar of pure, agonizing grief and lunged aggressively across the wide mahogany table. His expensive, tailored suit jacket ripped loudly at the broad seams as he violently threw his entire massive body weight forward, completely ignoring the heavy crystal water pitchers and thick leather binders that shattered and scattered across the room. He reached across the polished wood with his large, powerful hands extended like lethal claws. Vincent successfully grabbed Bradley directly by the throat with terrifying speed and devastating accuracy. His thick, strong fingers immediately locked around his biological son's pale neck with a crushing, suffocating grip that instantly cut off his desperate airflow. Bradley let out a terrible choked gasp and violently thrashed backward, causing his heavy leather chair to tip over completely. Both men crashed violently onto the expensive imported carpet in a chaotic, tangled mess of flailing limbs and tearing fabric. The refined corporate boardroom instantly transformed into a brutal, bloody gladiatorial arena. Cynthia leaped out of her seat with a piercing, hysterical scream that shattered the remaining silence. She desperately threw herself toward the two struggling men, frantically pulling at Vincent's broad shoulders in a pathetic, useless attempt to save the very son she had secretly conspired with for decades. "Please, Vincent, stop!" she wailed loudly, her perfectly styled hair falling wildly across her face as her sharp, manicured nails dug uselessly into his thick suit jacket. "You are going to kill him. Please let him go." But the grieving billionaire completely ignored her desperate pleas, consumed entirely by a blinding red haze of ultimate revenge. Stephanie, my previously composed and elegant daughter-in-law, scrambled backward on her hands and knees until her back hit the solid glass wall of the locked room. She curled her trembling body into a tight, defensive ball, desperately cowering in the dark corner, with her hands securely covering her ears. She was openly sobbing now, completely paralyzed by the sheer violence erupting just a few feet away from her ruined silk dress. The 50 senior members of the corporate board of directors reacted with absolute unified panic. Several older men shouted urgently for someone to intervene while others physically climbed over their heavy leather chairs to escape the violent, chaotic epicenter of the room. The polished professional executives pressed themselves tightly against the locked magnetic doors, frantically pushing their hands against the solid, heavy wood, but there was absolutely no escape. I stood perfectly still at the head of the long table, leaning heavily against the smooth wood with my arms casually crossed over my chest. I did not flinch. I did not shout. I simply watched the brutal, devastating consequences of their own monumental greed completely consume them. I watched the fake family I had mistakenly loved tear itself into bloody shreds. I deliberately let them violently fight each other on the floor for exactly 30 consecutive seconds. I watched the heavy purple bruises rapidly form and listened to the terrifying gasps of my enemies receiving their poetic justice. 30 seconds was the precise amount of time I had calculated they deserved to suffer before the law permanently intervened. When the final second quietly ticked by, I slowly reached my right hand back into the deep inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I calmly pulled out the small black digital remote control and firmly pressed the secondary blue button resting near the bottom edge. The magnetic security locks sealing the double doors instantly disengaged with a loud, sharp electronic click. Before anyone inside the panicked boardroom could even attempt to react, the heavy wooden side doors violently burst open with explosive, terrifying force. A massive tactical team of heavily armed Federal Bureau of Investigation agents, United States Marshals, and local city homicide detectives aggressively swarmed into the dark room. They moved forward with flawless military precision, raising their black weapons and shouting deafening commands that completely dominated the absolutely chaotic corporate space. Heavy tactical boots pounded against the polished hardwood floor as the armed federal agents swiftly secured the perimeter of the massive corporate boardroom. The harsh metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around wrists echoed sharply, cutting directly through the lingering sounds of heavy breathing and shattered glass. The arrogant villains who had confidently walked into this room expecting a glorious financial coronation were now being forcefully pinned against the mahogany table and the glass walls. I stood perfectly still at the head of the room, calmly watching the absolute destruction of my enemies unfold with perfect mechanical precision. Stephanie was the first to completely break under the crushing pressure of the sudden police raid. The elegant, sophisticated daughter-in-law I had warmly welcomed into my home and personally gifted a massive luxury condominium was now violently sobbing in the corner. Her expensive silk dress was torn, and her perfectly styled hair was a chaotic mess. She desperately tried to negotiate with the stoic federal investigator, securing her arms behind her back. "Please, you have to listen to me," she wailed loudly, her voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "I can tell you absolutely everything about the hidden offshore bank accounts. I will give you all the encrypted passwords." She continued to beg, tears streaming down her pale face. "I will testify against all of them if you just give me a generous plea deal. I was just following orders." The federal agent completely ignored her desperate bargaining, firmly tightening the cold steel cuffs and forcefully hauling her up to her feet. I felt absolutely no pity for her. This was the exact same woman who had smiled sweetly at my bedside while attempting to feed me a highly lethal, untraceable cardiac arrest inducer just a few very short days ago. While Stephanie pathetically attempted to trade her loyalty for a reduced prison sentence, Cynthia realized that her monumental 35-year deception had reached its absolute end. The flawless, sophisticated mask she had worn for 4 decades shattered completely. She managed to break away from the arresting officer for a brief second and threw her heavy body across the ruined boardroom carpet. She violently crashed onto her knees right at my feet, desperately grabbing the fabric of my tailored suit pants with her shaking manicured hands. Her pale face was contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated terror and agonizing desperation. "Harrison, please!" she wailed hysterically, her loud voice bouncing off the high glass windows of the corporate execution chamber. "You have to stop them. Please tell them this is just a terrible misunderstanding." I looked down at the woman I had unconditionally loved and blindly trusted with my entire life. She was looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes, actively attempting to use the same artificial affection that had kept me completely blind to her toxic betrayals for nearly 4 decades. "It was all Vincent's brilliant, terrible idea," she sobbed loudly, pointing a shaking finger across the large room. "He manipulated me, Harrison. He forced me to go along with the horrific plan to take your company. I never truly wanted you to die. I love you, Harrison. I have always truly loved you." Her desperate, pathetic lies hung heavily in the cold air between us. I stood there looking down at her weeping form, feeling absolutely devoid of any lingering affection, sadness, or pity. The deep, crushing emotional pain I had suffered in the dark isolation of my private study had been entirely consumed by a cold, hardened, absolute resolve. I looked directly into her crying dark eyes. "You do not know the true meaning of that word," I said softly, my deep voice remaining perfectly and entirely devoid of any emotion. I smoothly and deliberately kicked my leg backward, forcefully ripping the fine fabric of my tailored pants, completely free from her desperate, clutching grasp. I took a slow step back, putting physical distance between myself and the toxic parasite I had mistakenly called my beloved wife. "You sold your soul, your family, and your honor for money," I stated coldly. "Now you get to pay the ultimate price. Enjoy your long time in federal prison." 2 strong federal marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing Cynthia aggressively by her shoulders and pulling her forcefully away from my feet. She screamed and thrashed wildly against their firm grip, but they easily secured her wrists in heavy handcuffs, completely ignoring her loud, hysterical protests. Across the ruined boardroom, the physical aftermath of the brutal fight between father and son was being handled by the local homicide detectives. Bradley was violently hauled up from the carpet, His expensive custom suit was torn to shreds and bright red blood streamed steadily from a deep, ugly cut above his dark right eye. His face was heavily bruised and rapidly swelling from the furious, unhinged physical attack delivered by his own biological father. Bradley staggered on his feet, looking completely disoriented and absolutely terrified as the cold metal cuffs locked tightly around his wrists. The arrogant, smug corporate executive who had confidently handed me a gold pen to sign away my entire logistics empire was now a broken, bleeding criminal. He desperately looked across the chaotic room, seeking any kind of salvation. But he did not look at me, the man who had funded his entire luxurious, privileged existence for 35 long years. Instead, he looked directly at the wealthy billionaire rival being handcuffed against the far wall. "Dad, please," Bradley cried out, his voice cracking with immense pain and raw panic. "You have to help me. You have to use your lawyers to fix this." Vincent Cross turned his head and glared at his biological son with a look of pure, unadulterated, murderous hatred. The grieving father who had just discovered his own flesh and blood had murdered his youngest legitimate son offered absolutely no comfort. "You are completely dead to me," Vincent snarled, viciously spitting the bitter words across the room. Vincent was aggressively shoved forward by the federal agents, completely ignoring the pathetic, bleeding son who had double-crossed him for a mere $3 million. I stood silently in the center of the massive room, calmly watching the heavily armed officers systematically march the four villains toward the wide-open double doors. The 50 senior members of my corporate board of directors remained huddled together near the back wall, watching the unprecedented, shocking spectacle in absolute stunned silence. They had just witnessed the complete, undeniable destruction of a massive criminal conspiracy orchestrated from inside my very own private home. I watched carefully as the federal agents forcefully shoved them into the waiting elevators, 35 years of a fake family cleanly excised like a tumor. Stephanie was still weeping loudly, her head bowed in absolute shame. Next, they pushed Vincent inside his face, a hardened mask of furious, silent defeat. Bradley followed, stumbling weakly on his feet, the bright blood dripping slowly from his chin onto his ruined white dress shirt. Finally, they dragged Cynthia into the heavy metal box. She looked back at me one final time, silently begging for a rescue that was never coming. I stood still. 6 months have passed since the heavy magnetic doors of my massive corporate boardroom opened to reveal a heavily armed swarm of federal agents. The harsh, bitter winter that had frozen the city of Chicago completely melted away, leaving the sprawling, busy streets bathed in the warm, bright, healing light of a brand new summer. The natural transition of the changing seasons perfectly mirrored the profound, total transition within my own personal existence. I spent the first few agonizing weeks after the sudden police raid working incredibly closely with the federal authorities, local homicide detectives, and my absolutely ruthless corporate lawyer, Jonathan Reed. We had to carefully, meticulously ensure every single loose end of their monumental criminal conspiracy was permanently tied and securely destroyed. The extensive legal proceedings that immediately followed the chaotic arrests were swift, brutal, and entirely unforgiving. The American justice system moved with a terrifying mechanical efficiency that left my former fake family absolutely no room to breathe, lie, or manipulate the truth ever again. The fake official death certificate they had so proudly displayed on my California king bed was officially destroyed, and the $20 million they had illegally withdrawn from my emergency offshore banking network was fully recovered by federal agents within 48 hours. Every single asset, every bank account, and every digital footprint was completely scrutinized and locked down by the government. Vincent Cross, the arrogant, ruthless billionaire who had spent his entire adult life violently destroying rival companies and happily stealing other people's happiness, was completely eradicated from the global business world. His massive international logistics empire collapsed practically overnight when the devastating news of his direct active involvement in a murder-for-hire conspiracy became public knowledge. The federal government immediately seized all of his corporate assets, froze his countless hidden offshore bank accounts, and dismantled his entire executive board. During the highly publicized criminal trial, he looked like a hollow, broken, pathetic shadow of his former intimidating, confident self. The crushing, absolute realization that his own biological son had brutally murdered his youngest legitimate child had completely destroyed his once sharp mind. He did not even attempt to mount a vigorous legal defense against the overwhelming charges. He sat quietly in the crowded federal courtroom, staring blankly at the solid wooden table while the strict judge sentenced him to spend the remainder of his natural life behind the cold steel bars of a maximum security federal prison. He will die alone in a tiny concrete cell, completely stripped of his massive wealth, his false dignity, and his terrifying power. The corporate monster who had relentlessly tried to take my life was completely swallowed whole by his own massive blind greed. Bradley met an equally devastating and highly permanent ultimate fate. The spoiled, arrogant young man I had lovingly raised, generously funded, and blindly trusted for 35 long years finally faced the absolute maximum legal consequences of his monumental betrayal. His highly expensive defense attorneys frantically tried to argue that he was heavily manipulated by his mother and his biological father. But the overwhelming physical evidence was completely undeniable in the court of law. I sat in the gallery and watched the federal prosecutor hold up the torn, expensive dress shirt, permanently stained with the heavy iron, rich red clay and diesel fluid from my restricted off-the-books quarry. It was the very same shirt I had watched him frantically scrub in the basement laundry sink alone at midnight. The high-definition surveillance recordings captured from my private study and the completely recovered body of the murdered assassin, securely wrapped in the heavy canvas tarp, permanently sealed his dark doom. He was officially convicted of first-degree homicide, attempted murder, and massive corporate financial conspiracy. When the heavy legal sentence of consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole was formally announced, he completely broke down right there in the silent courtroom. He openly wept like a terrified child and desperately called out for me, begging the old man he thought he had completely outsmarted to somehow miraculously save him from his terrifying, grim reality. I sat perfectly still, looking at his bruised face with absolute cold, total indifference. I did not feel a single drop of pity for the toxic parasite who had actively planned to stop my beating heart with a lethal poison just so he could steal my lifetime of hard, exhausting work. I was violently dragged away in heavy metal chains, a convicted murderer who will spend the next 50 years rotting in a tiny dark cell, constantly looking over his shoulder in absolute, constant fear. Stephanie, the elegant, sophisticated daughter-in-law, who had so sweetly offered me a cup of hot chamomile tea, along with a lethal, untraceable chemical compound, learned a very harsh, permanent lesson about loyalty and ultimate betrayal. Her frantic, desperate, pathetic attempts to secure a generous legal plea deal by eagerly offering to testify against her own husband and her mother-in-law completely, entirely failed. The ambitious federal prosecutors did not need her highly unreliable testimony because my former Central Intelligence Agency tactical team had already provided them with flawless military-grade surveillance footage of her actively committing the terrible crimes inside my master bedroom. Without any valuable leverage to trade for her precious freedom, she was forced to squarely face the full crushing weight of the justice system. She was officially sentenced to serve 2 consecutive life sentences for her direct active role in the attempted assassination and the massive financial conspiracy. The expensive luxury condominium I had generously bought for her as a warm, welcoming wedding gift was immediately seized by the government to help pay for the massive financial legal restitutions. She will spend the best remaining decades of her young life wearing a cheap, scratchy institutional uniform, completely stripped of her expensive silk dresses, her imported expensive makeup, and her false, elegant, charming smile. She foolishly traded a beautiful life of absolute unlimited luxury for a permanent cold concrete cage. But the most profound and perfectly poetic justice was absolutely reserved for Cynthia. My wife of 40 years, the deceptive woman, who had comfortably shared my bed and my life, while secretly plotting my ultimate violent demise, suffered a fate that was arguably much worse than a simple standard prison sentence. She narrowly avoided a direct attempted murder charge because her highly expensive lawyers successfully argued she was not physically present during the dark midnight disposal of the body at the quarry, and did not directly physically hand me the poisoned blue pill. However, she was entirely destroyed by the ruthless financial and civil courts. My brilliant loyal lawyer, Jonathan Reed, flawlessly executed a series of highly complex, ironclad infidelity and absolute fraud clauses deeply buried within our original extensive estate planning documents. Because she had knowingly engaged in a continuous 35-year affair and actively conspired to commit massive corporate theft, she was legally aggressively stripped of every single physical and financial asset she possessed. The vast millions she thought she had successfully transferred to untraceable offshore accounts were instantly frozen, recovered, and returned directly to my primary corporate holdings. She was left completely penniless, without a single dollar to her name. She could not afford a luxury apartment or even a basic, simple rental home in the worst part of the city. Today she lives in a highly depressing, critically underfunded state-run living facility located on the noisy, dirty outskirts of the city. She shares a tiny, cramped institutional room with a completely random stranger eating bland, tasteless cafeteria food and wearing cheap, donated clothes. She has absolutely no visitors because her entire wealthy social circle totally abandoned her the very second her horrific, shocking crimes became public knowledge. She is forced to wake up early every single morning and vividly remember the massive, beautiful, sprawling estate, the imported luxury sports cars, and the absolute unlimited financial freedom she selfishly threw away for absolutely nothing. As for me, I absolutely did not allow their monumental, terrifying betrayal to turn me into a bitter, isolated, angry old man. I actively used the sharp pain to completely burn the dead, infected, toxic wood out of my daily life and plant brand new, healthy, strong seeds. Over the past 6 busy months, I have totally restructured the executive leadership of my massive international logistics empire. I systematically removed every single director and mid-level manager who had shown even the slightest minor hint of questionable loyalty during the corporate crisis. I quickly replaced them with young, hungry, brilliant professionals who deeply value hard, honest work over toxic, petty corporate office politics. I personally supervised the complete removal of all the unauthorized surveillance tracking malware that Stephanie had secretly installed on my home wireless internet network, making sure my life was private again. I sold the massive empty Chicago estate, where all those terrible lies were carefully constructed, and bought a sleek, ultra-modern penthouse in the heart of the city that perfectly suits my new minimalist lifestyle. And at the very top of this brand new powerful corporate hierarchy sits the only single person in the entire world who truly earned my absolute unconditional total trust. My incredibly brilliant, fiercely loyal, and absolutely ruthless daughter Natalie. She proved her ultimate immense worth not through empty flattering words or fake acted affection, but through decisive, highly calculated, aggressive action when my life was in immediate, terrible danger. She did what was absolutely necessary to protect her father and the massive company I built. Today is Friday. Exactly 6 full months since that chaotic, violent, unforgettable morning in the locked boardroom. The late afternoon sun is shining incredibly brightly over the massive city of Chicago, casting a warm, beautiful golden glow across the towering reflective glass and steel skyscrapers of the busy financial district. I am standing proudly on the open-air private rooftop terrace of my massive corporate headquarters. The cool, gentle summer breeze softly brushes against my weathered face, bringing with it the distant, muffled, energetic sounds of the bustling city far below. I look out over the sprawling, endless urban horizon, feeling a profound, undeniable sense of absolute inner peace that I have not genuinely experienced in over 4 long decades. I am no longer carrying the suffocating, heavy, dark weight of a fake, perfectly acted family. I am no longer physically exhausting myself, trying to constantly provide unlimited luxury for ungrateful, toxic parasites who secretly wished for my death. I am completely, entirely alone, but I am absolutely not lonely. The memories of the poisoned herbal tea, the fake tears and the secret burner phone conversations have slowly faded away entirely, replaced by the solid, undeniable reality of my peaceful new life. Natalie walks quietly onto the open, spacious rooftop, wearing a sharp, perfectly tailored dark suit that flawlessly matches her commanding, serious, professional presence. She stands right beside me, resting her strong hands gently on the smooth, clear glass railing. We look out at the beautiful, glowing city together, sharing a comfortable, silent, mutual understanding that requires absolutely no unnecessary words. I reach deep into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket and slowly, carefully pull out a small, elegant velvet box. I open it to reveal the heavy, shiny, expensive gold-plated pen resting softly inside. It is the exact same expensive gold pen that Bradley had eagerly, greedily handed to me in the dark study, trying to violently force me to quickly sign away my entire life and my massive, hard-earned empire. I gently take the gold pen out of the soft black velvet and hand it directly to my loyal, trusted daughter. She takes it with a firm, steady, strong grip, looking at me with deep, mutual, undeniable respect. Resting on a small, outdoor glass table right behind us is a thick, heavy stack of official corporate transition documents. But these are absolutely not fraudulent papers designed to secretly steal my vast wealth. This is a legitimate, fully authorized Chief Executive Officer contract, transferring complete total power to the rightful perfect heir. Natalie walks confidently over to the table, leans forward, and smoothly signs her name on the dotted line using the heavy gold pen. I watch her smoothly sign the final legal document, feeling an overwhelming, massive surge of genuine, undeniable paternal pride swelling deep inside my chest. At exactly 70 years old, I am absolutely not at the bitter, sad end of my long life. I am proudly standing at the very bright, exciting beginning of a beautiful, brand new dawn. I have successfully, permanently transferred the heavy daily burden of intense corporate leadership to a brilliant woman who will undoubtedly passionately take the logistics company to incredible, unprecedented new heights. I am finally completely, entirely free to travel the world, to read, to breathe, and to simply exist without constantly nervously looking over my shoulder, expecting a knife in my back. I survived the ultimate, darkest betrayal and emerged significantly stronger, infinitely sharper, and completely spiritually liberated. The most important lesson I learned through this agonizing, brutal journey is that blood is just simple biology, but true, unyielding loyalty is an active, deliberate, difficult choice. True wealth is not measured by the millions in your bank account, but by the authenticity of the people sitting at your dinner table. For decades, I allowed the illusion of a perfect family to blind me to the parasites feeding off my life's work. Trust is a beautiful thing, but blind trust is a death sentence. When you sense deception, do not confront it with emotion. Confront it with cold, hard evidence. Do not fear cutting off toxic people, even if they share your roof. Sometimes you must burn the entire forest down to let the healthy trees grow. If this story opened your eyes, hit the like button and subscribe. Have you ever discovered a shocking betrayal from someone you trusted completely? Drop your experience in the comments below. Let me know where you are watching from, and stay tuned for the next story of survival and truth.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain and I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low. But the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my Father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss,